Hey everyone. All right, so we are going to go over chapter 3 in this video. Um, chapter 3, go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint here. Yeah. So chapter 3 is all about language and communication. Very important components of critical thinking. Um, you know, I think, we've already learned that while we may have a tendency to think of critical thinking skills as a very individual, internal, sort of cerebral endeavor, that it's not. Critical thinking very much includes how we interact with the world around us. And when we are specifically dealing with other people, language and communication becomes of paramount importance in order to facilitate critical thinking. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. So the chapter opens with a picture here of a car bombing site. And I thought the question that I asked in the caption was pretty interesting and a great way to open the chapter. So I wanted to include it here in the PowerPoint and just kind of ask the question and then kind of go through the chapter and all of the information. And, you can be thinking about this question as we go through the information. I think you'll have a pretty quick answer to it, but that answer you might be able to even add more to it as you continue to think about and learn about how communication and language are so integral to critical thinking. But the question is, how does poor communication skills or lack of communication contribute to distrust and even acts of terrorism? Now, this chapter is not about acts of terrorism, but I think the question is posed because even though it is an extreme example, it is a very big example of how important language and communication are. And when we lack an understanding of language and when we lack good communication skills, it can lead to distrust. So on a personal level, that can lead to distrust with the other people that you interact with on a regular basis. It can lead to a distrust in what we would consider like authority figures, whether that be sort of like your boss or law enforcement, medical professionals, experts in their field of study, the media, politicians. And that's not to say that the distrust happens because we lack poor communication skills. It also is because other people will lack poor communication skills or use language in ways that create distrust. But if we don't have a basic understanding of this, the distrust can grow. And, is that how one of the reasons why we end up with acts of terrorism is because of lack of communication, poor communication skills, meaning even, lack of communication means no communication. Poor communication skills means, an attempt is being made, but the skills are not as strong as they need to be, so you still get a bad result. And then just the use of language in general. So it's an interesting question to pose at the beginning of this chapter. We'll go ahead and get started on what the rest of the chapter entails. So obviously good communication skills are an important part of critical thinking. They enable effective critical thinking, but they also enable decision-making, effective decision-making. We're going to look at, we got to keep avenues of communication open. You have to be able to communicate with others clearly and accurately. That's going to be, recognizing your own style of communication, recognizing that there are many different styles of communication. that can be dictated by many different variables, and that we are using precise wording, that we're not using ambiguous terms and ideas, that we are not using, overly emotional language, that we are not using faulty definitions, things like that. You have to be able to communicate clearly and accurately, taking care with word use, and then being on the lookout for when other people are lacking communication skills or are using language and communication in manipulative ways. So what is language? Language is just a system of communication with arbitrary symbols, whether spoken, written, or nonverbal. Arbitrary meaning there is nothing, there are no languages that are the language. That is why there are so many of them, spoken, written, and nonverbal. Arbitrary means someone along the way, usually a group, has decided this is how we are going to communicate. This is what these letters, put in this combination is this word, and this word means this thing. Nonverbal communication especially is very arbitrary because, certain gestures, the same gesture can mean many different things across the world. I do think that the one nonverbal communication that seems to be universal is the smile, which is interesting. But otherwise, it's all arbitrary. It was decided at some point that these things would mean these things. But it's different around the world. And by creating a shared reality among people who speak the same language, again, spoken, written, or nonverbal, it becomes the primary means of transmitting cultural concepts and traditions. And that is why communication styles are so important to recognize, because languages are based on culture. That's the whole purpose, is to transmit cultural concepts and traditions, right? There are 7,000 known languages in the world. I would have never guessed that many. And they all sort of use the same basic grammatical rules or syntax. The grammar rules is like, subject verb agreement, things like that, pronouns, all the grammar stuff that nobody really enjoys learning about. But if syntax is the order of words, how we present the ideas in a sentence. So 7,000 languages, and all human languages have the same basic structure in a way. And we are born with the innate ability to acquire language. We have to learn the language, but we don't have to learn how to learn the language. It is innate in all of us. And it's a pretty amazing thing. Language is amazing. It's the foundation of civilized humanity. But at the same time, we kind of take it for granted, and we don't think about how important it is, and we don't think about how different it can be. Obviously, we do know there are many different languages, and we understand that when we come across someone whose native language is not the same as ours, that presents an opportunity, right? We don't necessarily think about the nuances of language. and how those can affect critical thinking. So there are several functions of language, mostly informative language, directive language, expressive language, and ceremonial language. So we're going to take a look at each of those real quick. So informative language, exactly what it sounds like, providing information. It's declarative sentences, right? So Princeton University is located in New Jersey. Capital punishments do not deter crime. So informative language is typically either true or false, or could be proven to be true or false, right? Princeton University is located in New Jersey. That is a true fact. Capital punishments do not deter crime. That is that's informative language, and perhaps we could prove it's true, or perhaps we could prove it's false, right? Directive language is used to direct or influence actions. So close the window, please meet me after class. Hand gestures, like holding your hand up to indicate stop, right? So directive language. When we're talking about like types of sentences, this would be like a command sentence, right? Expressive language communicates feelings and attitudes. Often we'll use emotive words, which are words that are used to elicit certain emotions. Poetry is a fantastic example of expressive language. That is what poetry is all about, is communicating feelings and attitudes, eliciting certain emotions. I think you could even add music into that, because that's what music does too, right? So art in general is going to be an expressive language. Again, it doesn't have to be verbal or written, right? But even things outside the arts, language that we use on a daily basis is expressive. And we often use emotive words even when we're not using expressive language, like an expressive sentence. So we could say boys are strong-willed. That sounds like informative language, right? True or false. But we've used an emotive phrase in there, strong-willed. That is eliciting a certain emotion, right? So now we've taken what sounded like an informative sentence and changed it into expressive language because of that emotive word. The opposite of that, boys are strong-willed, people might say girls are pushy. Again, sounds informative, but it's using emotive words to elicit an emotional response. Strong-willed versus pushy. The same behavior in a male child, he'll get termed strong-willed. The same behavior in a girl, she's going to be called pushy. Emotive. It is eliciting a certain emotion. And then we have ceremonial language. These are used in sort of like formal, prescribed, socially constructed situations. So even just greetings. How are you? Hello. Hi. How's it going? Or I do in a marriage ceremony. Amen at the end of a prayer. Or shaking a person's hand. Or bowing in certain cultures, right? So ceremonial language. It's not language used in ceremonies. I mean, it can be language used in ceremonies, but it's not just language used in ceremonies. It's more of those the socially accepted ways of dealing with certain social situations and interactions. Okay? So obviously we use ceremonial language on a daily basis, even if it's just greetings, but we tend to use ceremonial language in small talk. It comes about a lot in small talk. It comes about a lot in situations where you are interacting with people in passing, right? But then we also use ceremonial language with those we are close to and see on a regular basis and spend time with. So we use ceremonial language quite a bit. We use, obviously, if we go back to the other slide, we use informative language all the time. And uh, I think we use directive language on a daily basis as well. It, you know, it can be sort of this command, close the window, but it can also be in a more polite manner. Please meet me after class. Or we might even say, can you please close the window? Right. Um, and depending on the context would dictate whether it would be acceptable to have that more command-like tone or more of the polite tone, right? So we use informative language every day, directive language, probably use it every day. Expressive language, this is the one where you may not think you use it every day, but if you pay attention, especially when it comes to emotive words, I bet we use them every day. Ceremonial language every day. So those 4 functions of language, those are the 4 main reasons why we use language. And we use language in those 4 ways practically every day. All 4. And sometimes the languages can serve multiple functions, right? Or meaning the language we use, might accomplish several of those functions. Using language effectively to convey information, to provide direction, to express feeling is essential for individual and collaborative critical thinking. We have to be able to use informative language. We have to be able to use and understand directive language, expressive language, and ceremonial language. It's important to understand that while language enriches our communication of ideas and feelings, it can also contribute to ambiguity and misunderstanding, right? We're going to kind of get into some of that. But intellectual curiosity and awareness of other people's language use, and I don't mean someone who speaks a different language. I mean someone who speaks the same language as you and how they're using it within those 4 functions, right? Paying attention to how people are using language is, it makes us less susceptible to misunderstandings and manipulation, which is where the chapter is going to end, is the manipulative use of language. That's what we're getting to. So nonverbal language, kind of already touched on it a little bit. But it is, you have to pay attention to it because nonverbal cues like body language and tone of voice, they help us interpret verbal communication. How many times have you heard someone say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it? That includes your body language and your tone of voice, and maybe even your word choice, right? Because we use nonverbal cues all the time to reinforce verbal communication. You have to be able to be perceptive and to think about these things critically. But don't forget that images like artwork and photographs are also a way of communicating ideas and feelings. So why would that matter when it comes to critical thinking? Because we're not talking about like an art class where you're being told to critically analyze a photo or a piece of art. What it means is, especially in today's age, we are inundated with just as much visual communication as we are written and verbal, right? We get so much visual input from the world. And I mean, it really has always been that way. But with, smartphones and technology and social media and just the ridiculous amount of advertising that is out there, we are bombarded by images. So you have to really keep in mind that images also communicate ideas and feelings, right? They are not innocuous. They are not safe. They're not innocent. You know, they convey just as much as written and verbal language does. So here's an example, right? This photo is of a little girl. She was 9 at the time in 1963. And, her and these other children are running down the street. She happens to not have any clothes on, which makes the image even more startling. But they're running down the road after being badly burned by a napalm attack in South Vietnam. And the napalm attack was performed by South Vietnamese forces who were, we were their allies, the United States was, right? So the photo resulted in such outrage and such a public, cry for an end to the war that it actually did contribute to bringing the war to an end several years later. It was definitely an important component of public awareness and public opinion on the war. So, it wasn't a pre-planned image. The photographer just happened to catch it. But just because it wasn't a pre-planned way of triggering our emotional response, it was used to do so, right? So it doesn't always have to be calculated or, part of some design or some program that's, sort of pre-planned. We can still use images that occur naturally or in the moment, spur of the moment, to create an emotional response. And this particular picture was probably stronger than any type of written opinion piece on the war. If this incident had been shared with the American public through a newspaper article, or even just on the air in a news program, without the visual accompanying it, it may not have had as big of an impact. But sometimes the visual is even more important than the words when it comes to language. It's gosh, and what's crazy is that is what so much of our existence, our experience of reality is: words and images. And they're constantly coming at us. We have to always be aware of what function they're serving and how to interpret them correctly. Let's talk a little bit about nonverbal communication and withholding information, right? Because we're going to talk about lies later, which is sort of deception using verbal and written language. But this kind of touches on deception with nonverbal language. So the example they give is in 2013, when Oprah Winfrey interviewed Lance Armstrong over the whole scandal of performance-enhancing drugs. So he confessed to using performance-enhancing drugs. And in the interview, watching the interview, a lot of body language experts and just regular people, they found it very unsettling, because even though he was confessing, his body language indicated that he was being deceitful at the same time. So he sometimes pressed his lips together, which signals he was withholding information. So I don't know if you want to delve into nonverbal language and lies and deception, but apparently holding your lips together means that you are withholding information. Covered his mouth frequently, right? signaling he's blocking information or lying. A lot of people had a really hard time with that interview. Because on the one hand, he's confessing to these really serious infringements, breaking the rules, and but did not seem to be forthcoming with his answers. Body language also plays a really important role when it comes to juries and trying to determine if someone is innocent or guilty. And that's an interesting thought. These questions are really good ones right here. Should jurors be allowed to see the defendant during trial? Should the defendant sit out of the juror's view so as not to allow his or her body language to influence jurors' decisions? Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, if this person is guilty and they're showing signs of guilt with their body language, then that just helps reinforce the juror's decision. Sure, okay. But what if you have a person who is guilty, but is aware of how body language can give away someone's guilt, and they've learned to cover it up? What if you have someone who is innocent, but maybe for other reasons, their body language is conveying something that makes them appear guilty, and that influences the jury? Or, what if we think, okay, letting them see the defendant is a good thing because the defendant's body language can tell the jurors, give them more information to go off of. But just because we know a person's body language can, exhibit signs of guilt or signs of lying or signs of deception, does that mean that every juror is going to understand how to correctly interpret body language? So I can see both sides of this, right? Like, maybe it would be better if jurors could see the defendant, because I wonder how many jurors get influenced by the defendant's body language and assume that they're guilty when they are actually innocent. An interesting concept here. All right. So, language, as we said, 7,000 languages across the world, and it's all arbitrary. Language is a cultural construct. Good critical thinkers realize that word choices and nonverbal cues significantly influence how verbal communication is interpreted or misinterpreted, right? So we want to make sure that we communicate clearly, and we want to be conscious of language's complexity and flexibility. And we have to be willing to ask people for clarification if you are uncertain of their meaning. Do you know? I think when we're dealing with, people we're familiar with, or people that we aren't worried about judging us, and that doesn't necessarily mean people you know. I think there are situations in life where you are with people or around people you don't know, but you aren't afraid of them judging you. And then there are situations where we're around people we don't know, and we are very much afraid of them judging us. Do you know how hard it is for some people to simply ask someone to repeat themselves or to clarify? It's a big hang up for a lot of people. I don't know if they don't want to make it seem like they weren't paying attention and seem rude. I don't know if they are afraid that by asking for clarification, it will make them appear less intelligent. I don't know. I'm sure there's some psychological reasons behind it, but sometimes we struggle to understand what someone is saying or understanding what they mean, and we don't always ask them to repeat themselves or to explain themselves. And if we don't do that, then oh my goodness, like the risk of misunderstanding, the risk of escalating any kind of tension that might be there, just magnify, right? So you want to do your best to communicate clearly yourself, right? But you also can't be afraid. You have to be willing to ask other people for clarification when you are unclear, when you're uncertain of what they're trying to say, what they mean. Super important. All right, so let's take a look at definitions. That was something that I mentioned in the beginning of the PowerPoint as well. How definitions, if they are not solid, if they're not unambiguous, that they can lead to problems in communication as well. All right. First of all, even with words that we are clear on, you still have to think about definitions, because the English language especially is constantly changing, right? Think about how many words have come into the public conscience just in the last 10, 15 years. Think about words that were used often 100 years ago that don't get used ever nowadays. And even words that were commonly used 20, 30 years ago don't get used that often anymore. So English language especially is constantly changing. And that dynamic state means that the meanings of words change quite often. I mean, pretty often, considering imagined language would be sort of set in stone, right? But in order to communicate accurately and clearly, it is important to understand the difference between denotative and connotative meanings, right? So, it says all words have denotative and connotative meanings. I don't really think all words do, but a lot of words do. Most words have a denotative and connotative meaning. So a denotative meaning is it's the dictionary definition, right? But a connotative meaning is what we attach to that word culturally or even regionally. Stereotypes are a good example of words that have both denotative and connotative meaning. But even like the word white, you look it up in the dictionary, the denotative meaning of that word is going to have something to do with the color spectrum, right? But white reflects all light. Is that right? Oh man. Anyway, it's just a color, right? And that's what it's going to tell you in the dictionary. But think of all of the associations that we have culturally with white that have nothing to do with the word's actual meaning. Why do brides typically wear white wedding dresses? Because white has come to symbolize innocence and purity in our culture. But the word white has absolutely nothing to do with innocence and purity. There is nothing innate about that word that indicates innocence and purity. Innocence and purity are connotations that we have come to associate with that word, right? Denotative and connotative meaning. Being aware that most words have both. And a lot of times, in order to communicate clearly, you want to make sure that your word choice facilitates that. So if you have, because we have a million different ways of expressing one single idea, right? There are so many words out there that we can choose from to express an idea. So if you have an idea that you want to express and you've got choices of words you could use, and one of the words has a clear denotative meaning and either not much of a connotative meaning to it, meaning it's not a word culturally that we really associate with anything in particular, it's just a word, or so has no connotative meaning or has a neutral connotative meaning, versus a word where the connotative meaning might be negative. You want to go with the word that has a neutral connotation to it. When you are communicating with others, listening or reading their ideas, connotative words can clue you into certain things, especially when we're dealing with media, advertising, and politics. Watch out for the connotations of words. So try to be mindful of your own word usage, right? And knowing denotative versus connotative meanings. Pay attention to it out there in the world as well, what others are using, the word choices of others, right? Literature and music is going to use connotative words quite a bit because we have associations with them. They bring emotional responses. So good, also good in helping to analyze a poem, right? There are 4 major types of word definitions. So the connotative and the denotative, I mean, yes, those are types of definitions, but that's of one particular word. These are sort of like the categories of definitions that we're looking at. So there's stipulative definitions, which are given to new terms or new combinations of old terms, so like laptop, beer goggles and sexting, date rape. That hasn't always been in our lexicon. Pro-life and pro-choice, right? Those are new terms, maybe not new to us now, but you know, they haven't always been combined in that way. Using brand names to indicate a type of product, not necessarily the actual brand. So when we talk about Band-Aids, right, we're talking about adhesive bandages, right? And there are many different brands of adhesive bandages, but we call them Band-Aids. But Band-Aid is really just one brand, right? But gosh darn it, their marketing has been so powerful that they're all Band-Aids now. Same with Kleenex, right? They're just tissue. But goodness, that's actually something to really think about, is when you realize that you're using a brand name to refer to a type of product that may or may not actually be from that brand. Like Q-tips, that's another good one. Think about how successful the marketing has been for those. Lexical definitions are dictionary definitions, right? And one thing to keep in mind is that even in the same overall language, lexical definitions can vary from country to country. So like we speak English, but you know, native here in the United States, native now. um, Parts of Canada speak English. Obviously England, you know, um, Ireland, Australia. You know, like when we hear those languages, we can hear accents, but we understand the language. Uh, we can understand them. It's not a completely foreign language. But the definition of certain words here in the United States, you know, American English, are going to be vastly different than the definitions for those same words in English spoken in other countries around the world. So don't assume that just because you're speaking to someone whose native language is also English, that they're going to have the same definition of a word as you. And even here in the United States, regionally, it can, be different. Another thing to keep in mind is lexical definitions can be controlled. Stipulative definitions are sort of like the rebels in a sense, in that they are coming into the lexicon due to for whatever reason, a sudden popular usage of those new terms. And I don't know what the requirements are for a word to get added to Webster's dictionary, but there's a bit of control there, right? As to what words do get accepted into the dictionary, what words don't, how long it might take, who decides, right? So the lexical definitions are controllable, right? Precising definitions are used to reduce vagueness. They're split into two subsets: theoretical definitions and operational definitions. I don't really want to get into the specifics of those. It's not really needed for our purposes. And then there's persuasive definitions. So this is, again, I don't want to say it's not necessarily emotive words that are being used, but it's really more the purpose behind the definition, right? So, and these aren't the definitions that you look up in the dictionary either. Those are lexical definitions. Persuasive definitions are really more like definitions that we have agreed upon socially, or a group has come up with a way of defining an idea, and there's a purpose behind it. So, for instance, saying that taxation can be defined as a form of theft, right? If we looked up taxation in the dictionary, it's probably not going to mention anything about theft. A person or group has decided to define taxation as a form of theft, or that genetic engineering, the definition of genetic engineering is playing God with the human genome. You can see how those don't, again, it's not people setting out to say, hey, this should be the new definition of this word or this term. It's usually being used in conversation, being used in speeches, it's being used in advertising, it's being used in letters to the editor. It's being used in just specific innocuous moments, typically to persuade in one way or another. Why it's called a persuasive definition. They're trying to persuade us that taxation is the same thing as theft, even though the lexical definition of it is not. Right? So, hey, this is a fun one. I say fun, to be more aware of in the media and on social media and in politics and in advertising of any sort. When people or groups have sort of delved into persuasive definition for certain words and concepts and ideas, it's done a lot. So evaluating definition, right? Especially, obviously the lexical definition of a word has probably undergone evaluation. That's why it ends up in the dictionary. But all of those other types of definitions, we have to make sure that they're good definitions, right? That they're good ways of explaining a word or concept. So there are 5 criteria that you should use when evaluating definitions. First is the definition can't be too broad or too narrow. So for instance, saying that the definition of mother is a woman who has given birth to a child is far too narrow, because we all know that there are plenty of mothers around the world who did not actually give birth to their children, right? So that is not a good definition of the word mother. The definition of war as an armed conflict is too narrow, because there are plenty of different types of armed conflicts that could happen that don't equate with war. An armed conflict could be, getting into an argument with your neighbor and, punching the other one, or hitting the other one with a wrench. It could be domestic violence. It could be street violence. An armed conflict, there's so many different ways that an armed conflict could come about, none of which would qualify as war. So, can't be too broad, can't be too narrow. Second thing, the definition has to state the essential attributes of the term being defined, right? That has to be explanatory in some way and accurate. So the definition of a community college as an institution of higher education without residential facilities that is often funded by the government and is characterized by a 2-year curriculum that leads either to an associate's degree or transfer to a 4-year college includes all the essential characteristics of a community college. Can't just say a community college is an institution of higher education. It is, but that's not a fully accurate definition, right? You have to include as many attributes of the term as possible. Third thing, good definitions can't be circular, right? Logic should not be circular. Meaning you can't use the term itself or a form of the term, a variation of the term in the definition. You can't say the definition of a teacher is a person who teaches. That defines nothing for us, right? You can't say ketosis is a process that produces ketones. I mean, neither of those statements are false, but they don't define anything. Circular definitions, no good. Circular logic, circular arguments, no good, right? Okay. Good definitions should avoid obscure and figurative language, right? So obscure language. Definitions should not include highly technical terms. They shouldn't include jargon, especially if that term or the information is meant for individuals outside of a very narrow expert field, right? If you have a group of astrophysicists and they're writing, and they're trying to define a word that they're going to use just amongst themselves, then maybe the obscure, highly technical language is fine. But if they're trying to define a term or a concept that is then going to get shared with a larger group or the world at large, Those technical terms got to come out of that definition. All right. Similes and metaphors should not show up in definitions. They're great in poetry, right? Love is like a red, red rose, right? Great in poetry. But love is like a red, red rose doesn't actually define anything, right? So no figurative language. Stick to the arts and love letters and personal communication, not in definition. And definitions have to avoid emotive language, right? The definition of man cannot be someone who oppresses women, right? Even if we think that's true, that's not a good definition. It creates an emotional response. And that's the only reason why the definition is worded that way, is to create an emotional response. And you can't say that a feminist is someone who hates men, because that is not true either. Might some feminists hate men? I guess, maybe, I don't know. I don't know what being a feminist has to do with them. It's not a good definition. The only reason to use a definition like that is to create a specific emotional response. Neither definition is accurate. And when we're dealing with a definition that is using emotive words or emotive language, chances are it's going to be a faulty definition. It's being used for one reason and one reason only, to create the emotional response, right? All right, so enough about definition. Let's move on to communication styles. So good critical thinkers are aware that there are differences in individual as well as group communication styles. This is probably where the chapter fits most on. I think we do need to be very aware of different types of definitions, and especially those that are used sort of in the media and in politics. But being aware of communication styles is so important. Understanding our own style of communication and those of others, that is what facilitates good communication in relationships and in critical thinking. It's super important. All right. So there are 4 basic types of communication styles. We have assertive communicators. These are the people who can clearly and respectfully communicate their own needs, and they strive for mutually satisfactory solutions. We have aggressive communicators. These communicators attempt to get their own way by controlling other people through manipulation, force possibly, right? But some sort of control. Passive communicators avoid confrontation. They are compliant. They often put their needs on the back burner, right? Put the needs of others first. Then you have passive aggressive communicators. They avoid direct confrontation, right? So they're not in your face like aggressive communicators are. But they do use ways of getting what they want, a desired outcome. Usually it's very devious and manipulative, right? So that's what makes them passive, because they're not in your face, but passive aggressive communicators. Obviously, if you're looking at these 4 basic types of communication styles, we want to strive to be the assertive communicator, someone who is clear in their communication, but respectful at the same time. And it's not all about getting what you want. It is about communicating, compromise, mutually satisfactory solutions. It'd be interesting to look at the people in your life, family, friends, people at school, people at your job, and look to see if you can find someone, at least one person, who would fit into the assertive communicator category. and then another person who might be an aggressive communicator, someone who is a passive communicator, someone who's a passive aggressive communicator. I bet most of us already could tell off the top of our heads who the aggressive or passive aggressive communicators are. And I bet a passive communicator is probably pretty easy to spot as well, right? You got to think about the assertive communicators, right? Are they being clear and respectful? Are they searching for, mutually satisfactory solutions? Or have we mistaken someone as an assertive communicator when really they're passive aggressive? They're just really good at it. So interesting. Think about that. All right. So there are other things that can influence our communication style as well. Not, we got those 4 types, but gender affects our communication style, ethnicity does, and so does culture. Right? All right. So sex and racial differences in communication styles. So again, please keep in mind that these are generalizations based on centuries of sociology and anthropology and just studies in general worldwide throughout time, right? So does that mean that every woman will fit these descriptions? No. Does it mean that every man will? No. Again, these are just averages, right? Okay. Women tend to use communication to create and sustain relationships. Create and sustain. Whereas men use language primarily to get things done and solve problems. Right? Women tend to think that a relationship is going well if they can regularly talk to their partner about the relationship. We're checking in, making sure the relationship is going well. Men tend to think that as long as the relationship is going well, there are no problems. There's no need to talk about it. We don't need to talk about our relationship right now. Things are good. When men are uninterested in discussing a relationship or their feelings, their partner may misinterpret this as a lack of interest. But what it might actually mean is that man is happy and he thinks everything's great. Therefore, there's no need to talk about it. Not that he's not interested, right? But that is a misinterpretation that can happen due to communication styles. Many scientists think that a genetic role is there, that genetics plays a part in the different communication styles between men and women, because studies have found that women and men use different parts of their brain for language. So there is something there that could support this idea that men and women do truly have different communication styles and what their function is for both sexes based on the part of the brain that's being used for language. Other experts, though, they truly think that the communication differences are primarily, if not completely, a result of the way in which we've been socialized, right? Boys are taught to assert themselves, girls are taught to listen and be responsive, right? I don't see why it can't be both. All right. Different ethnic and cultural groups, because obviously that information was based on our culture. If you go to other cultures, some cultures define masculinity and femininity differently. In some countries, it's actually preferred that both genders have a nurturing and more feminine communication style. Every person should have a more what we would consider feminine communication style. But here in the US, at least historically, men have been socialized to be very individualistic, competitive, assertive, maybe even aggressive in their communication, right? So even though we're talking men and women, that was really more of an American difference between men and women. That's not going to prove to be true when you go to other areas of the world, other cultures. They're going to have different views on what's important when it comes to communication style. Women in different ethnic and cultural groups may communicate differently than their counterparts in other parts of the world. So in some countries, women are socialized to be more assertive. They smile less, they use less eye contact during conversation. But then in other countries, women are socialized to be less assertive, use more eye contact during conversation, right? Be more responsive. Men in different culture groups might communicate differently too than their counterparts in other parts of the world. So in some countries, men are socialized to be very uncomfortable with self-disclosure, talking about themselves and their feelings, and are more likely to use confrontation in conflict resolution. But in other countries, men are socialized to use compromise in conflict resolution. So there may be genetic components to it, but it certainly seems like that's not the only reason why men and women communicate differently. I mean, I think it shows that we are socialized, depending on where we grow up. We are taught to behave a certain way and communicate a certain way. So some examples of communication styles, is more cultural differences here. So Chinese culture values respect and dignity. This might lead them to be more hesitant to ask someone to repeat themselves if they don't understand what's being communicated. In many Eastern Asian cultures, nodding does not necessarily mean that the person agrees with or even understands what is being said. Instead, nodding is used to show that they listen. They may not be understanding, and even if they understand, they may not be agreeing. They're going to be nodding, right? Easy way to misinterpret someone's body language, right? In Hispanic cultures, communication is often oriented toward group cooperation rather than individual needs. And respect is highly valued, so they often prefer communication styles and formal communication styles, and they prefer to use titles instead of first names. So if you have someone who would otherwise be your peer, right? Someone who's on the same level as you, but their culture has, socialized them to use language formally, and they're constantly calling you, Miss Lester Trosher. And even though you would normally have seen them as an equal, the fact that they're being so formal and we can take it as like they're placing us above them. Otherwise, why wouldn't they just use my first name? It can unconsciously or subconsciously, not unconsciously, subconsciously, kind of make us feel like that person is inferior to us, that they're below us. That's something to keep in mind too. How these communication styles can affect how we view and treat other people, right? Nonverbal communication styles vary around the world as well, right? Culture plays a big part in nonverbal communication. So in Algeria, if we were to go and wave hello, right, they think to them that gesture means come here. But if we went to Mexico and used this gesture of come here, apparently it's an obscene gesture in Mexico. I don't know if I'm doing it exactly right. Come here could be this, could be this. But something that is very, simple and innocent in one culture could be seen as offensive and obscene in another. Cultural groups have their own rules for personal space, right? In the United States, Canada, Northern Europe, Personal space tends to be larger or bubble, pretty significant, right? Not a lot of touching, right? But in Southern Europe and in Arab and Latin American countries, personal space isn't as expansive, and there's a lot more physical touch involved in communication. Clothing, right, can be a type of nonverbal language. So Americans dressing very casually, going, to another country, on vacation or even for work, depending on what kind of work you do, you still might dress very casually, right? And if you are in an area of the world where clothing, how you dress, is of importance, walking around in t-shirts and jeans might be seen as a sign of disrespect, or they may just assume that you're just a very poor and untidy, slovenly person, right? I think we're all aware that globally we are all becoming even more connected, and it's important to understand that communication and cultural variations are important to be aware of and to take into consideration when you are interacting with other people. Super important, critical thinking. Oh, here's a good example of a cultural difference in communication styles. So in Arab cultures, it is acceptable for men to hold hands, and not romantically involved men, just men. So in 2005, Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, taking a walk with former President Bush, and he reached for President Bush's hand because they were walking on a very uneven path. He was unsteady. And President Bush had no issues with it. Let him grab his hand. Look, you can see, hold him while they're walking. Now, that photo, it disturbed so many Americans. The media even said it was an inappropriately intimate encounter. And I wonder what the citizens of Saudi Arabia would have said, or what they said if they happened to have been shown the same photo in their country and in the media as well. There, what was their reaction? I know how America and our media reacted at the time. But what was your first reaction to seeing the photo, right? What was the basis of that reaction? Was it reasonable? How can being aware of your emotional reaction to, nonverbal communication like this, being aware of your natural response, how can that, improve your ability to be a better critical thinker in situations where, you're coming across images or experiences like this? It also makes you wonder if we would, if culturally and in the media, we would have the same reaction now in 2022, 23. Oh my gosh, almost 20 years later. Would we react the same way to an image like that? All right, so this is where I think the chapter really hits on just how important language is when language is used to manipulate, right? Because not only does language inform us, but language can also be used to deceive us. It can be used to manipulate us. And that is typically done through three devices: emotive language, we've kind of already touched on, rhetorical devices, and deliberate deception, right? So emotive language, we've already talked about it. It's in words, language that is used to elicit a specific emotional response, right? When a factual issue arises, emotive language can slant the truth. It can obscure our critical thinking skills. It can get our emotions involved, right? And even though emotions are an important component of critical thinking, we learn that when we're not being critical enough, our emotions can hinder our critical thinking, right? We have to find that balance. And if our critical thinking skills aren't honed enough, if we're not using them and practicing them and building on them enough, then emotive language can trigger that emotional response, and then our emotions take control instead of reason and logic working with emotion, right? Emotive language is typically used to cover weak arguments. It's used in marketing, it's used in politics, and it can dress up as news in the media. Right? All right. Rhetorical devices are a lot like emotive language, but they kind of just have their own special category because it's even more deliberate psychological persuasion as opposed to reason being used to persuade. So some common rhetorical devices are euphemisms, dysphemism, sarcasm, and hyperbole. The euphemisms are politically correct terms would fall under euphemisms, perhaps. There are plenty of euphemisms that we use that have nothing to do with being PC. But here, so it's basically when you're trying to sugarcoat the truth, when you're using a word or phrase because you're afraid that saying the actual word or phrase is too harsh, it's too offensive, or even if it's just not offensive, maybe you just think it's rude. Maybe you're trying to spare someone's feelings, right? And again, that not necessarily in a politically correct way, just someone that you care about, right? Maybe you're just trying to make something seem better than what it actually is. So the term "the final solution" was used to refer to Nazi Germany's attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe during World War II. Final solution. Well, that certainly is a much nicer sugar-coated way of describing that goal. Using the term that saying that someone has passed away instead of saying that someone has died. Right? There's definitely a situation. There is definitely a context in which using the phrase "passed away" is much nicer than just saying someone has died. But for the most part, and especially when we're communicating with others whose feelings we don't necessarily have to spare, it's better to be direct, right? The term "enhanced interrogation techniques." Enhanced interrogation techniques. Sounds like a good thing, right? People need to be interrogated. There are techniques used in order to do so. And if we have enhanced techniques, that probably makes the job even easier or the results more reliable. But if we're using the phrase "enhanced interrogation techniques" when what we really mean is torture, then we're not really being honest with our language use. So euphemism is a word or phrase that's used to make something seem better, right? To have a more positive emotional reaction to it. Dysphemisms are the opposite. It is when you're using negative terms on purpose to produce negative emotional responses, right? So using the term "death tax" instead of "inheritance tax," it was a term created to elicit a disapproval for the inheritance tax. They started calling it the death tax so that people would have a negative emotional response to it, and therefore vote against it, right? In the abortion debate, the term anti-choice has been used instead of pro-life, right, to create negative feelings towards people who are opposed to abortion rights, right? Pro-life, I mean, I don't know, could we even say that pro-life is a euphemism and anti-choice is a dysphemism? That's an interesting conundrum. But at the very least, pro-life, pro-choice, those have been the terms for quite some time now. And then to try to replace pro-life with anti-choice, it's done, they were doing so to create negativity towards those who are opposed to abortion, right? I think we all know what sarcasm is. It's typically used though, like when we're in the context of critical thinking, and sarcasm can be used in many different ways, and it be perfectly fine to be sarcastic, although some people would disagree that sarcasm should never be used. But certainly the use of sarcasm does not always mean that there's a critical thinking issue at play, right? But when we are in situations when it is a context where critical thinking skills need to be in play, and it's a serious situation, a serious discussion, serious topic, whatever, if sarcasm enters the discussion, it is typically to deflect critical thinking, right? Or it is to create negative feelings towards the object of the sarcasm. Something to be aware of. I mean, sarcasm in and of itself, not bad. Sarcasm in certain contexts can hinder critical thinking. Hyperbole is exaggeration and overstatement. It is often used to distort the facts, right? So, especially with data and statistics, when we're just using very general data, hyperbole is saying, when you had an event where 100,000 people showed up, and you say that 1 million showed up, you exaggerate. Hyperbole, right? That's a good one to watch out for. Get this one for now. So all of those, the emotive language and the rhetorical devices, obviously those could be used intentionally as a way to manipulate us, but they're not always used intentionally. Sometimes when someone is trying to make an argument or trying to be persuasive and win over someone or win over a group, they have their own emotional investment in the topic. And sometimes that spills out into their language. And it is not intentional per se. I mean, if they were given an opportunity to go back and sort of revise it, and they were like, yeah, no, that's good, then maybe you could say it was intentional. But even then, not always intentional. But deception and lying is very deliberate. When someone lies, it is a deliberate attempt to mislead someone. And I don't think I need to really go into how detrimental lying can be. But in terms of like what this class is trying to teach you, it's going to derail honest communication and it's going to damage trust. And once a lie has been unearthed, it is hard to come back from that. You have to get good at detecting lies. As good critical thinkers, we have to be able to detect, recognize, and challenge lies. That's why you should always check information, right? Do your research, verify, right? Be aware of nonverbal cues that could indicate lying. Less physical movement, blinking, changes in voice tone and pitch, errors in storytelling, like when they keep changing things, right? I'm not going to say lying doesn't happen. Obviously, in our personal lives, lying probably happens more than we'd like it to. In the world at large, like when you're on the job, I don't know that lies are going to be a huge problem. But there might be a person where you have to be on the lookout for whether they are being unintentionally or intentionally misleading. Right? So that is the importance of language when it comes to critical thinking. It's how we organize, express, and critically analyze our experiences. It shapes our understanding of reality and of ourselves. We need, as good, clear critical thinkers, we need to clearly define terms or ask for clear definitions of terms. We have to be mindful of our own communication styles and those of others. We need to be aware of the manipulative and deceptive powers of language. And I would say, that is a huge one in our world today. Right? All right. The last thing here in chapter 3 is the critical thinking issue, and this one is on perspectives on free speech zones on college campuses. This is actually what your critical thinking issue assignment is on this week. So when you're reading the 2 selections from the critical thinking issue section, keep in mind what we've learned about language, right? Language and communication. All right, but if you have any questions about any of the other information there in chapter 3, definitely reach out. Otherwise, feel free to go ahead and move on.